Sometimes when someone is lost in the woods, finding them might lead you to something else entirely. Something not as human and far more hungry. Today's episode features stories about dangerous entities in national parks, mysterious army bases, and creatures that try to break down your front door. So, lock the deadbolt and pray no one comes knocking or clawing. Like this episode and comment below which story was the creepiest to you. For me, I really enjoyed the first one. And if you want your story to possibly be narrated, share it with me at darkstories.org. Now, let's begin. The following story is a creepypasta that was inspired by the terrifying and unexplained things that happen in our national parks. I was sent to find a missing girl in Yellowstone National Park, but what I found should not be biologically possible. From all_calm 1999. When are we gonna get there? I asked.
Just shut up, we're about there,
said my coworker James. James and I were on a job to investigate a report of a missing person on the southeastern side of the Yellowstone National Park. So, I'm reading the file. The girl's wearing a blouse. It's 42 degrees Fahrenheit outside. I exclaimed.
I don't know, dude. I've seen people on the side roads with nothing but a Speedo.
I look at James and laugh. It's rounding 5:25 p.m. and the sun is setting.
Okay, so the map says that we're close. Around 15 minutes.
James says. I look out the window and watch the tree line. We'd been driving to the backwoods for around 2 hours. Do you still have any cigarettes? I ask.
Nope, I smoked my last one an hour ago.
Frustrated, I turn back to watch the road. This drive had been so boring. Most of the time, there was a radio tower to give my phone signal. We drive in silence for a while.
You know, we're probably not gonna find her,
says James. What makes you think that? I ask.
Have you ever figured out that we don't find missing people very often?
I pondered that statement for a while, and I did realize that we don't ever find anyone really. Or at least when we do, they're dead.
Bill, you alright?
He asked me, looking periodically at me while driving. Huh? Yeah, I just never really thought of it like that before. Just as I finished that sentence, our radio came through.
Bill, James, got a lead on the missing girl. Over.
The operator's voice came again, saying,
Head to the south entrance off the side road 1/2 mile past Grant Village. Over.
Punch in the coordinates,
James said quickly, pulling a U-turn and speeding through the side road and onto the main trail. At this point, we were speeding through the trails, the sky turning a dark red, and the sun below the trees getting darker and darker. I never liked the dark. Even now, being 24, I still don't like the dark. I wonder sometimes, what could be out in the vast wilderness besides what we know? As I'm daydreaming, James hits the brakes and we stop.
Bill, grab your flashlight and grab your pistol.
I grab my handgun and my flashlight to step out of the Jeep. The air was so heavy. It felt really weird. Like that feeling you get when you're frightened and there's no reason to be paranoid, but you still are. We closed the Jeep doors and started into the woods, walking quickly, shining our beams of light in different directions. The air was so tense you could cut it with a knife. We walked for 30 more minutes, and we found something under some leaves. A small, brown sneaker.
This is James. We found a small sneaker. Could this have any correlation with the missing girl? Over.
James spoke through his radio.
No idea, James. Keep it moving. Radio in if you need backup. Over.
James nodded and said,
"All right, over."
Then he put his radio back in its chest holster. James looked at me and gave me the 2 fingers pointing up then down to make me move forward. So far, I feel that we've walked around 200 yards. As I kept walking, I stepped on a large piece of cloth. I shine my light at it. Looks like part of a blouse. "James!" I call out. He comes over to me quickly.
"Is that part of a blouse?"
"Yeah." He radios in the evidence and we keep going. I start to feel like something is with us. I don't know how to explain it. It's as if something or someone was watching us from the trees. James? Do you feel that?"
"Do I feel what?"
"Well, I feel that something's like, I don't know, watching us or something. It just doesn't feel right here." At this point, I think we were somewhere between Heart Lake and the Yellowstone River. We stop for a second and we pull out some waters. "James, how long have we been walking here?" I ask and he turns to look at me, then looks at his watch.
Around 40 minutes.
I look down at the ground and take a swig of water. I finish it, swallowing the last drop. Then I hear something. I look in the distance and focus on the sound. I scrunch my face and aim an ear to the sound to determine what it is. It sounds like crying, with moaning added between the sobs. I slapped James's shoulder without moving my gaze. "Do you hear that?" He does the same as me, and the 2 of us listen for a while. The sound isn't moving, it's staying in the same place. We listen, and I look at James with a confused expression on my face. As I look at him, the sound stops. By this time, the moon was somewhat lighting up the forest in front of us, so I was able to scan the woods. It's then that I see movement in the corner of my eye. I flick on my light and shine where the path of the movement was going. I saw a human foot pass by a tree. Holy crap. I take off with my light and pistol drawn. I was following a figure running through the woods, and it was fast, like a marathon runner. James was right behind me and was saying that we needed to get closer. "What do you want me to do?" I ask.
"Run to the left and try to run across her."
I ran to the left and tried to catch up with the missing girl. We lost her in the darkness. The 2 of us stood there for a second and listened again. We looked around. Then I looked at James. "Did you see how fast she was running?"
"I don't know how a little girl can run so fast,"
James said, breathing heavily. We caught our breath, and the sobbing, moaning sound came again from the left of us. We decided to go on a slower approach. We methodically moved in an oval shape to the sound. I was creeping up on them, and I didn't have my light on, but something looked off with how her body looked. Her back was humped, and she had her arms retracted under her chest, like a T-Rex is portrayed having its arms held under its chest. At this time, we were 50 feet away from her. James sounded off at her, saying,
"Little girl, we're rangers. We're here to take you."
He stopped dead in his tracks. I whispered to him, "What's the matter?" He didn't answer. He just kept staring at the girl, mumbling something in fright. What is he looking at? I thought to myself, feeling that there was no reason to be afraid. It's just a little girl, I told myself, turning on and aiming my flashlight at her. I'll try my best to describe what I saw. The memory itself has already given me goosebumps just thinking about it. When I turned on the light, the little girl was standing with her back to me. The first thing I noticed was how messed up her back was. It was bent in an unnatural angle downward into a hump. Her vertebrae made it look like she had spikes coming off of her back. She slowly turned around, and when she did, I could feel all my blood leave my face, and a sharp, bone-chilling coldness ran down my body. When she made the full turn to face me, I saw that her legs were like birds' legs. The knee was bent inwards, and her lower legs were coming out past her hips. I looked further up. She was so malnourished that her pelvis was showing through her skin. Her arms had shortened, and she only had 3 fingers on each hand. Her head and neck are what haunts me the most, as her neck had merged with the back of her head and connected with the rest of her skin. And her mouth. God, the mouth. It looked like her cheeks had been sawn down the side and went down into her neck. She moved her mouth and the jaw squirmed and shook with each movement. All the while, she was moaning and crying at us, screaming at us with a gurgled tone in the back of her throat. She squatted her legs and they went out behind her, and when she did that, she started to stumble towards us, screaming and crying in a gurgled moan. I looked at James, who had his gun drawn on her. He was crying profusely, tears running down his cheeks. He was mumbling, shaking all over his body. The girl at this point hadn't made a move towards him, and when she did, he shot her in the shoulder. She turned, screamed, and cried, then began to run at him. He opened fire upon her again, unloading the entire magazine into her. She wouldn't fall. He turned and yelled at me.
"Bill, shoot it!"
I did as I was told, aiming at her and unloading my whole magazine as well. As we sat there, minds running blanks, we just stared at each other. James slowly grabbed his radio and held it tight in his hand, shaking slightly.
We have a code 1096 on location N.
After that was sent, 15 minutes later, a team of men wearing MOPP gear stepped out of Humvees, telling us to get in the vehicle. As I got in and drove away, I saw the men in suits pour gasoline onto the thing we shot and burn the body. I quit that night. What I saw that night is something I will never forget and will never leave my mind. I don't have answers to the things I think about at night, and now that I'm typing this, those are answers I realize I don't want to learn. Mojave Mountain Man, from Wicked Wendigo. I grew up in many different towns in Central and Southern California. I attribute this to my stepfather, who was enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps from the early 2000s to the early 2010s. From ages 7 to 12, I lived on a Marine Corps training base in the Mojave Desert, not far from the Yucca Valley National Park. I was 10 years old at the time of this experience. The following story is true, and I have other true stories regarding my time in the Mojave, if anyone is interested. Summers in the Mojave were as you would expect, hot. Some summer days could reach up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. My stepdad was a low rank in his career at this point, so unfortunately, we were given a low-quality family home on the base. This meant that vital appliances, like the air conditioner, constantly malfunctioned. Usually, when this happened, I could be found at the local public pool, or exploring the miles of sand-covered rocky hills that surrounded the base. This story happened on one such occasion. I can't remember exactly, but I'd say it was around 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The AC was broken, and the repair company was not scheduled to fix our unit for another 2 days. Being inside the house did little to make the heat subside. Outside actually felt cooler with the occasional breeze flowing into my open bedroom window. I'd planned to spend my day at the local pool, but unfortunately it was being sanitized. Apparently, a group of teens thought it would be hilarious to throw dog poo into the pool. Needless to say, I was in hell. I decided to go to my friend's house. We'll call him Parker. I went to Parker's to see if he wanted to go explore. We did this together often. He said he'd like to, but he needed to finish his chores first. When he finally finished, we headed off for our usual hangout. It was a little playground about 100 yards from a barbed wire fence that surrounded the base. We called it home base. I asked him where he wanted to explore, knowing it would most likely be a place we'd already been to dozens of times before. He said, "Well, I have a secret place we can go. I found it the other day." I was excited and replied, "Heck yeah, where is it?" Parker pointed to the barbed wire fence. I asked, "Why are you pointing at the fence? There's no way we can climb that. The barbed wire would rip us apart." He chuckled, stood up, and motioned for me to follow. When we reached the fence, we walked about 20 yards to our left. In front of us stood 2 large sage bushes. They'd grown out about 3 feet from the fence line. They measured up about 4 feet high and had roughly 2 feet of room between the two. We walked to the opening and Parker pointed to a small hole at the bottom of the fence. The heavy rain from the previous week had washed away the sand from the bottom of it, making a small hole just big enough to fit your arm through. We decided we would dig under the fence so we could squeeze through and explore the running trail that was just on the other side. We'd seen many people running the trail before, so we dug. About an hour later, we had made the hole big enough to fit through. We agreed not to venture too far, because we didn't know the area, and it was getting later in the evening. With that, we squeezed through and popped out on the other side. We began our walk down the trail. Occasionally, we would stop to make sure drones weren't flying overhead, watching us, which is hilarious to look back on. A paranoid adolescent mind will make up some crazy things. Anyway, we were about 10 minutes into our walk when I spotted something next to a large rock on a hill, just off the trail to our right. The hill was about a half-mile ahead of us. The bright sun was glaring off of something. It was about a foot above the ground, just to the bottom right of the large rock. I pointed it out to Parker. He insisted that we go investigate, but I was hesitant. I wasn't comfortable going off the trail. With a few convincing words and a bit of peer pressure, I reluctantly agreed. We started our way towards the hill. I stopped for a moment when I noticed the glare had disappeared. I asked Parker, "Did you see that? It's gone." But then the glare reappeared suddenly. Parker replied, "Hurry up, we're almost there." We continued to walk when we heard an all too familiar sound, the sound of helicopter rotors. We instantly dropped to the sand. My heart was racing. I was sure the MPs had somehow found out we dug a hole under the fence and left the base. We couldn't tell immediately where the helicopter was, but Parker pointed out the small black dot far above the hill we were heading towards. Meanwhile, the glare had once again disappeared. We lay on the ground for roughly 60 seconds, when suddenly we saw something large stand up from where we last saw the glare. It was a huge man. We still had a bit of distance between us and the hill, so I could only roughly make out his height and clothing. Not his facial features, though. He stood approximately 6'4" and wore an army green jumpsuit. He stood in place for only a few moments before turning around and running down the hill in the direction of the incoming helicopter. We continued to lie down for a few more minutes until the helicopter flew overhead of us and off into the direction of the base. We slowly stood up and debated our next move. Parker insisted we continue and see where the man had gone, but I wanted to head back home. The fact that a random man was out here with us made me anxious. Again, peer pressure took over my rational thinking, and before I knew it, we were ascending the hill. We made it to the top, and my anxiety grew at what we discovered. The first thing I noticed was a large outline of where the man had been lying down, molded into the sand. Next to the outline was a medium-sized duffel bag, and sitting on top of it was a pair of binoculars. This had been the glare I'd seen. It also explained why it would occasionally disappear and reappear. This man had been watching us. My stomach filled with anxious butterflies, and I told Parker I wanted to leave, now. He agreed, but before we could start our descent down the hill, I noticed something moving in the direction the man had run. It was the man. He was at the bottom of the hill, just staring at us. I stood there in shock. I could see him clearly now. He had long gray unkempt facial hair and had dirt all over his face. He then did something that made me almost cry with fear. He slowly raised his left index finger to his mouth, making the shh motion with his lips. That was it. I was done. I ran in the direction of the base with Parker close behind me. We made it back to home base and vowed to never go in there again. We never told anyone in fear of getting into trouble for making such a stupid decision. To this day, Parker and I talk about the situation occasionally. Who was the man? Why had he been watching us so intently? And why did he run? Was he scared of the helicopter? All these questions are fun to think about now, but I'm glad I never got the answers. What on earth was that? From listener. This all happened 5 years ago. Back then, I was the type of person who wouldn't believe until you see it. And now, I might as well just believe. I've heard loads of monsters and ghost stories in my life. I found them very thrilling. So thrilling that when I had the chance, I would daydream about me in a situation when I would be hunted down by some unknown creature. I'd have to find a way to stop it. My friend Larry was also interested in the paranormal. He and I would sit around my laptop, looking up creepy stories and paranormal creatures. The stories we found would always grab our attention. We'd make comments about what we would do if we were in that person's shoes. I was at his house one day. It was almost evening, and a few cars were driving by since he lived in a remote area. There was a tree line not too far away from his backyard. Larry and I would go on walks there, take in the sights and atmosphere of the woods. Little did I know that my perception of those woods would soon change forever. After nightfall, Larry was at the sofa watching television. I was on my phone watching some of my favorite YouTube videos. I was getting tired though, so I got up and told Larry that I was going to bed. Larry said okay, and I left to walk up the stairs to one of the rooms he said that I could use. As the beds were very close to the window, I could see the awesome night sky. The moon and stars glowed brightly above the dark silhouettes of the trees. Soon my eyes grew heavier, beckoning me to at least close them, falling into a deep slumber. I woke up sometime later. It was still dark. I just couldn't sleep anymore, and I didn't know why I couldn't. I tried to close my eyes, but they would just fly open again, as if refusing to sleep. Finally, giving in at the fact that I couldn't sleep again, I sat up. Now, I didn't know if Larry was sleeping or watching television still. He was infamous for watching TV from dusk till dawn. The first thing I did was to look out the window. Still saw the moon and stars, and I saw the woods not too far away. There were lots of deer around, mind you, and most of them wandered too close to Larry's backyard. As expected, that night I did see a deer in his yard. It was sniffing around the grass. Larry had a tall gate that surrounded his backyard, I guess to not let anything in, but obviously that didn't always work. Anyway, I was staring at this deer for a while. And then it stopped eating the grass. Its ears perked up, and it began to stare at the tree line. I followed its gaze. Over there, the woods were as dark as ever. I couldn't see anything except the tall, dark shapes of trees. What was this animal looking at? My guess was some kind of predator. The deer stood there quietly. It was like the whole area was put under a time-stop spell. I grew worried. I didn't know what this deer was looking at, but I had a burning sensation that it wasn't good. And then the deer dashed away in fright, and something came dashing out of that tree line. Some kind of animal that I've never seen before. It was all black, so all I saw was just a giant black mass charging from out of the trees at first. I could see pointed ears, a long snout showing dirty teeth. The eyes reflected a bright yellow with small pupils. It was on all fours, so my first thought was that it was a wolf. But I couldn't recall anyone around these parts reporting wolves in the area. And this thing was far too large. I watched it walk slowly, its heavy footsteps pounding the ground underneath. It looked left and right, all the while smelling the air, probably looking for more prey or food, probably looking for me. At that thought, I ducked down, covering myself like a scared child who had just seen a terrifying monster emerge from his closet. I didn't move, I didn't cry, I didn't speak. I laid there, praying to God that this creature, or whatever it was, didn't find its way into the house. And if it did, Larry and I would be done for. Then I woke up again. I had fallen asleep again somehow, because now the sun was up. I was so thankful that it was dawn. I jumped out of bed and walked into the hallway, only to hear Larry calling my name from the back door that led to the backyard. I found him, and I was met by a confused and scared look on his face. He pointed and looked down at something in the grass. "What kind of animal makes tracks this huge?" he asked. My heart sank. Those paw prints were in the place where that wolf creature thing was standing the night before. I had to steady my breath so Larry wouldn't notice. Then he turned in my direction looking at something else. And what kind of animal makes claw marks that deep and long? He motioned me over to look where he was facing, and my jaw dropped. There was a multitude of deep claw marks in the back door. This only leaves me with one conclusion. The wolf monster was real, and it tried to get inside. Haunted House from Spooky House. When I was 11, my parents bought their first home. It was our first 2-story home, and it even had a pool in a large backyard. My dad was probably the most excited about it, because he could get us our first dog now, as all the other homes we had rented didn't allow them. We got ourselves a yellow lab named Boomer. A year later, we got a second dog, a Schnauzer mix named Misty. They were primarily outdoor dogs, and we'd bring them in around dinner time or when the weather was bad. In California, the weather is almost never bad, and we were outside with them a large portion of the time. The backyard, as mentioned before, was very large. We lived in the center of a small cul-de-sac, so our property was almost wedge-shaped, with a small front yard and a wide backyard. There was a large deck that spanned from one side of the house to the other. Where the deck ended, on the side of the house with my parents' room, there was an awning that covered that section of the deck, as well as a wooden fence that separated the main part of the yard from the side yard. Under the awning, there was a metal screen door in the fence that allowed us to get to the side yard. These details, the deck and the door, are where things began. I no longer remember how soon after we moved in when it happened. Within a year or two, I think. Activities continued until I was maybe 27 or 28, after I'd moved out. My mother heard things first. While she was getting ready for work one day, she heard the metal door outside open and close. Then she began to hear heavy footsteps on the deck outside of her bedroom. It was like there was a large man wearing boots moving around out there. She told me later that she was scared someone was going to break in. But when she looked outside, there was no one there. The dogs had never even made a peep either, despite being out there with the noise. From then, she would continue to hear footsteps around the house every now and again. One of those first summers there, my 2 younger siblings and I were allowed to stay home alone for the first time. This was liberating, until we were hanging out in the dining room and began to hear someone walking around upstairs, specifically in my room. I laugh thinking about it now, but I remember the 3 of us arming ourselves with kitchen knives and slowly stalking our way up the stairs. I couldn't have been older than 12 or 13, my youngest sibling no older than 9 or 10. The sounds we heard had stopped midway up, and we never found anyone upstairs. For a few years, we got acclimated to unusual sounds and occurrences. Heavy footsteps, mostly downstairs, but at night was strictly relegated to my bedroom, along with the sound of papers shifting around, occasional touching on the shoulder or low back, as though someone were squeezing by, and on the rarest occasion, a rosy perfume that neither my mom nor my sister wore would fill the room. Once, the sliding closet door in my parents' room slammed closed as I was using the mirror on it. And when my older cousin, who lived with us for several years, moved out, my sister took her room across from my parents' room. She had to keep the door locked when she slept, because someone always jiggled the handle all night if she left it unlocked. One night, my sister woke up to the silhouette of a man feeling her forehead. She said that the man had spoken, said something like, "No, that's not good," before turning and leaving. She wound up very sick with swine flu during the outbreak several years ago. My mom told us that the previous owner was a California highway officer who succumbed to cancer in her bedroom. My bedroom had been his office, and my sister's room was his daughter's room. From then, we were amused by everything that happened around the house. It seemed to be the officer, just going about his routine on occasion. Of course, it didn't stay that way. The atmosphere in the house began to get heavy, or oppressive. My youngest sibling's room was beside the top of the stairs, and I'd have to pass by in order to get to my room. I'd always feel like something was lurking in the corner of their bedroom, watching me. Going downstairs was always terrifying too, as I always feared that I was going to be pushed from behind. I always made sure to close their door when they weren't in there. My sibling turned reclusive and drank a lot. My parents are good-intentioned people and generous, but they were reluctant to accept that all of their children were LGBT. My sibling was most affected by it. The more they drank, the more they hid away, the worse the air became. In 2015, my most terrifying experience took place. I can't remember where my parents were, nor can I remember where my sibling was, but my sister was at work and had taken Misty with her. I was home alone, with only my cats and my new dog, Rue. Boomer had passed away 4 years prior. The only lights on in the house at the time were in the living room, where Rue and I were hanging out. There was the sound of someone large and lumbering slowly making its way down the stairs in the dining room behind me. I froze, my heart rate rising as I listened. Rue was sleeping and hadn't budged. The stairs continued to creak and groan, and then whatever it was stepped onto the ground floor. Now, the houses where we lived in California are elevated, not built directly into the ground. So I could tell exactly where whatever it was in the house, based on what part of the floor was creaking in the other room. It moved slowly around the dining room, its footsteps heavier than the ones we'd heard in previous years. It was taking its time, and my blood was running colder and colder. The couch I was on was against the wall that separated the kitchen from the living room. The dark doorway was just 10 feet to my left. It stopped in that doorway. It never crossed into the living room. But I was afraid to look at it, afraid of what I might see. I could feel that it was still there. I could feel it staring at me. "Rue," I whispered harshly. Rue was stirred awake in the middle of the living room floor. I never even had to point it out to her. She immediately locked eyes with something in the doorway and growled. She is a sweet dog, a border collie, but she bared her teeth and growled at this presence. I braved a glance then, and there was nothing there. No shadow out of place, nothing. But Rue didn't let up. Not until my sister came home from work a couple of minutes later. The oppressive air lifted and Rue stopped. Misty didn't even bat an eye as she plodded in to greet me, so I figured whatever had been there was now gone. Nothing as significant occurred until about a year later. My sister had begun a webcomic that was well received. She would spend hours daily drawing it. It would sometimes be in her room where her desk was. One night she was drawing a panel for it, looking up satanic symbols for reference, and I was on the floor sitting against her bed. There was something in her room all of a sudden. I could see it this time. It was a three-dimensional shadow, and the most bizarre thing I've ever seen. Her lamp beside me was on, and the shadow wasn't terribly dark. It would have been easily missed if it had stayed still, but it didn't. I watched out of horrified curiosity and bewilderment as the figure walked in a counterclockwise circle throughout the room, stopping behind my sister, looming over her as if watching her computer screen, before repeating the process. It would walk behind me, through the bed, and through the lamp beside me, and again stop behind my sister. I tried waving my hand in front of the lamp in different areas, trying to debunk what I was seeing, but I couldn't. Finally, I told her I was going to hang out somewhere else because there was something in the room that I didn't want to see anymore. She told me the next day that later that night, she woke up to use the bathroom and had gone to her closet next to her desk for a pair of shorts. When she bent down, something inches from her face growled at her. She bailed on the shorts and just prayed that my parents wouldn't come out of their bedroom across the hall while she hurried to the bathroom. She then took the old painting of Jesus that had survived a house fire that my mom lived through as a child and placed it in the closet. She didn't have any other significant experiences in that bedroom, not even when we drunkenly made a Ouija board and tried to contact the original spirit in the house, the good one. There was barely any response, though I remember it saying that, yes, it was there. My sister demanded that it prove itself real and even insulted it, but there was no reply. So we said goodbye and decided to go to bed. But when we went to the kitchen to deposit our drinking glasses, the sink was running full bore. We may have gotten off easy then, all things considered. When I got married, my sister and her friend became our roommates that year. They experienced something in that apartment briefly. My sister had a significant health issue that required her to move back into our childhood home after the lease was up. She had moved into my old bedroom then, and there was one last experience there that she told me about. As usual, my sister keeps her bedroom door locked when she sleeps. Well, she woke up one night to the most pungent smell, like rot and ammonia. The ceiling was vaulted, and so the ceiling fan had to hang down a couple of feet. The fan, despite not being on, was swinging almost violently. I had never had activity like that in my bedroom before, and I told her that. She then fetched that Jesus painting again, and once more the activity would stop. My family has since moved from that house. Their new house doesn't have the same oppressive aura, and I've never felt that same aura since. I can stand in a dark room unafraid, unlike how it would be in my childhood home. The feeling of something watching you, the overwhelming feeling of malice in the air. It's not even worth the novelty. I never want to experience anything like that again.